Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Philosophy in the Forest. I'm Shasta, and I'm joining you from the beautiful rainforests of East Hawaii Island. And I'm here today to talk to you about my favorite author, Susan Sontag, and one of her essays called Against Interpretation. And in this essay, Susan Sontag almost challenges her reader to stretch their idea and concept of mimesis, mimicry. So, in her essay Against Interpretation, Sontag is basically telling her audience, in my opinion, don't be basic. Stop reducing art. I'm going to apply that even further into our critique of society, philosophy, other things, into these simplistic meanings and predetermined frameworks, and that our modern ideas of criticism and that which influences ideas is sort of intellectually lazy because it forces everything to go through these pre-described, predetermined funnels, these analytical lenses that have been laid down for us, in terms of political parties, religion, you know, any philosopher that you can name, and for the sake of this exercise, I'm going to try to not name them, but we can name, the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, Christianity, Islam, Marxism. All of these different ideas carry weight and meaning, each of them analytical lenses. And instead of just experiencing, something like politics or literature as or art for its or film for its own immediate meaning, we there's a tendency to sort of filter our meaning through interpretations that are given to us from other people. And so Sontag asks her readers to go against interpretation, to not be basic, to abandon what she calls the philistine habit of filtering all of our criticisms through whatever the zeitgeist is, you know, be it capitalism, be it religion, um, and abandon these habits and start encountering things for what our opinions are on a direct basis. So Sontag was an interesting person. She passed away in 2004, so fairly contemporary writer, and she was also a subject of Andy Warhol's screen tests. So she was definitely prominent um, on the art scene. So she reminds people that when art first came into its being, it actually had a magical purpose. So those cave paintings at Lascaux, they were there to give reverence to nature and sort of symbolize humanity's encounter with the things that they saw in nature. And so then Plato began to point out the fact that art is mimesis, the imitation of reality. And so the Greek philosophers began to question the nature of creativity. What is the value of art? So the Platonic idea was that art is just mimesis, and that art has to justify its existence because the mundane, the material world is filled with this mundane mimicry. And again, like in the beginning of the essay, just reflecting back, like Sontag is asking her reader to go against interpretation, to go against these ideas of imitation. So, Aristotle comes in that art, it may have mimicry in it, but there's also a trompe-l'oeil, or that art itself has to evoke compassion in the one who experiences the art. That art whether mimicry or not, whether a lie, it has a value because it's a form of basically therapy. It helps people to sort of conceptualize what their existence is. But there's a fallacy that throughout the history of art that has come into being that art doesn't have to mimic reality. I mean, after the abstract impressionisms and artists like Jackson Pollock came along, you know, art can be so many different ways to maybe mimic theory or movement, but it's basically just a consciousness and a reflection. Um, and so, whether we conceive art as a picture inside of a picture, a model of reality, a statement, something that has to come from the artist's statement, um, and the content of art may change throughout history, whether it's just lines on paper or depictions of the Virgin Mary. It's art that defines itself through definitions that are, created by the artist's statements. So Sontag is critiquing interpretations inside of museums where you see a placard that tells people what a piece of art is about. So, in this way, the artist is coerced into making a statement. And against interpretation, Sontag explores this pressure. So, there's a lot of pressure in our society to make statements about our experiences, and that people are forced to enter this world where originally they have this innocence of experience itself. And then they have to introduce this experience to various theoretical concepts. And it's also Sontag that then critiques both Plato and Aristotle for forcing the experiencer to pull themselves out of the experience and then define it in terms of criticism, and to ask themselves or invalidate something as to whether or not it's mimicry. And that she says we have no obligation to overthrow any of this or justify art or to basically come up with these obtuse explanations. What the contemporary needs is this idea of finding themselves, to sort of avoid this aggressive tendency to follow what the zeitgeist says. So we have so many overlays, so many templates in our modern interpretations. So there's Freudian and Marxian hermeneutics, these approaches of seeking hidden meanings and truth behind various contexts according to what Marx said, according to Freud's interpretation. And so instead of liberating the thinker themselves from their own interpretation, they're confined to whatever the current political climate, the zeitgeist, says about what a piece of art, about what thinking is, about what our prevailing narrative is, according to what we decide is important for the taste of our current society. So we had recently seen cancel culture, and the auditing of comedians like Louis C.K. and Jerry Seinfeld. Um, so people like this were critiqued because their work was no longer seen to align with what, our current political climate, what the zeitgeist was saying. And so art is really bound to conformity. And for art to be given a status of importance, it has to validate itself, and it has to validate this need for interpretation. So art is needy, according to Sontag. and it has to conform to the canon of the prevailing narrative. And any art that moves against this canon is censored. So Sontag uses Freudian thought and Marxist frameworks to sort of as a model for intellectual conformity, not critiquing these particular writers, but using these large names in philosophical thought so that her audience can understand. When someone says Marxist, they have a certain response to that. And that is the intellectual conformity that Sontag is warning us about when we apply these theoretical frameworks to our criticisms, our interpretations of, she's speaking about art, but just literature and culture and politics in general, because it stifles a genuine personal response. So that's where it shifts down to this idea of not being basic. The zeitgeist is the dominant spirit of the age, and they create this immense pressure for intellectual conformity by establishing frameworks for understanding our world rather than the individual being able to interpret the world by frameworks that are based on things that they have learned. There's an interpretive lens that is given to them, and it's often rooted in, identity politics, social justice framework, all kinds of cultural frameworks, but it can be religion. And Sontag is not against these things. She is warning us that by doing this, we stifle our individual thought process and that we are dumbing ourselves down and that we're just becoming these echo chambers for prevailing attitudes without thinking for ourselves. It's intellectual timidity. It's being timid. So people suppress their immediate, authentic responses in favor of what is socially acceptable to think. Instead of saying, this moves me, people prefer to do what feels safe. They reach for approved vocabulary, approved analysis. The zeitgeist basically, for Sontag and in these arguments, is totalitarianism. But not through direct censorship, but through overwhelming social pressure to conform to sanctioned ways of thinking and feeling. So the critique of interpretation is about the understanding of how, what is fashionable, what appeals to the masses actually robs the individual of the confidence to trust in their own perception and their own responses. And so Sontag actually calls for her audience to think for themselves and to move past these impulses that are put into us by prevailing narratives, the things that influencers tell us to think, the things that newscasters tell us to think, the ways in which various worldviews and paradigms influence our individual perspective and interpretation of the world. So, thank you so much, and thank you for exploring the work of one of my favorite writers, Susan Sontag. Until next time, aloha.